Don't embarrass yourself. People like you don't speak our language. The sentence didn't just land, it sliced clean through the low hum of clinking glasses and soft jazz, sharp enough to make a few heads turn without anyone daring to react. The restaurant sat 40 floors above downtown, all glass walls and golden light, where deals worth millions were whispered over aged bourbon and silence carried more weight than words. At the center of it all stood Victor Kane, tailored suit, cold smile, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. Around him, men leaned in, listening, laughing when he laughed, nodding before he even finished speaking. Power didn't follow him. It settled wherever he stood. And tonight, that power was directed at a single person who wasn't even supposed to be part of the conversation. Naomi Carter moved quietly between tables, black uniform crisp, posture steady, her presence barely acknowledged except when someone needed something. She had learned the rhythm of places like this, the unspoken rules, the careful balance between being invisible and being useful. She didn't interrupt. She didn't linger. She listened. Always listened. Because in rooms like this, people revealed everything when they thought no one important was paying attention. Victor barely glanced at her as he spoke, but the dismissal was intentional, precise, like everything else he did. Just serve, he added, flicking his fingers slightly, not even looking in her direction. A small gesture, but in that room, it carried authority. Naomi didn't respond. She simply nodded once, calm, controlled, the kind of reaction that gave nothing away. But her eyes moved, briefly, toward the older man seated beside Victor. Mr. Han. His father. Dressed more simply, posture upright, hands resting gently on the table as if he didn't quite belong to the performance happening around him. He hadn't spoken much since arriving. Not because he had nothing to say, but because no one had made space for him to be heard. The conversation continued above him, around him, through him. Deals, numbers, projections. Fast English, layered with confidence and ego. And then, suddenly, Mr. Han spoke. His voice was firm but aged, flowing in Korean, quick, precise, carrying urgency that didn't need translation to be felt. The table paused. Not fully. Just enough for confusion to ripple through the surface. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, a faint smirk. Pulling at the corner of his mouth. He does that sometimes, he said casually, waving a hand as if dismissing the moment entirely. Old habits. A few men chuckled. One of them glanced awkwardly at Mr. Han, then back at Victor, unsure whether to pretend to understand or ignore it completely. Most chose the easier option. Ignore. The words hung there anyway, unanswered, suspended in the air like something unfinished. Naomi stood a few feet away, still holding a tray, still silent. But something had shifted. Not in the room. In her. Because she understood every word he had just said. And more importantly, she understood why it mattered. The words did not fade. They lingered, heavy, unresolved, like a question no one in the room wanted to answer. Mr. Han's voice had not been casual. It had been precise, layered with something deeper than simple conversation. Concern. Warning. Maybe even disappointment. Naomi felt it immediately, the weight behind each syllable, the subtle shifts in tone that most people would miss. She kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was already moving, translating, connecting. He had not been speaking randomly. He had been asking about the deal. About the numbers Victor had just presented. About something that did not add up. Victor did not notice. Or worse, he chose not to. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and leaned back like a man completely in control of the moment. Let us stay focused, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. We are here to talk business, not revisit old conversations. The men around him nodded quickly, eager to stay aligned. Agreement came easily when power set the tone. Across the table, Mr. Han said something again, shorter this time, firmer. The kind of statement that was not meant to be ignored. A pause followed, longer than before. One of the guests shifted in his chair. Another cleared his throat quietly. No one understood the words, but everyone felt the tension. Victor's jaw tightened for just a second. Then the smile returned, thinner now. "He worries too much," he said lightly, glancing around as if inviting everyone to dismiss it with him. Different generation. A few soft laughs followed, but they did not carry the same confidence as before. Something in the air had changed. Naomi stepped forward to refill a glass, her movement steady, controlled, but her ears remained locked on every sound. Mr. Hand's gaze shifted toward her for the briefest moment. It was subtle. Almost nothing. But it was enough. Because in that glance, there was recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she might be. Someone who understood. Someone who could hear him when no one else could. Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully, finishing her task, but her heart was no longer quiet. She had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where truth was spoken softly and ignored loudly. Rooms where the most important voice was often the one no one chose to hear. And she knew something else. If no one answered him, the moment would pass. The deal would continue. And whatever warning he was trying to give would disappear into polite laughter and expensive silence. Victor set his glass down with a soft click. "Now," he said, leaning forward again, reclaiming the room, "as I was saying," but before he could finish, Mr. Hand spoke once more, slower this time, each word deliberate, undeniable. The room did not understand the language. But it understood one thing. This was no longer a small interruption. This was something that mattered. Naomi stood still, just behind Victor's chair, tray in hand, breath steady. She had a choice. Stay invisible, like she was expected to. Or step into a moment that was never meant for her. And for the first time that night, Victor Kane was not the one controlling what would happen next. The silence did not break. It deepened. It stretched across the table like a line no one wanted to cross. Victor's voice faded before it could fully return, his last word hanging unfinished in the air as every eye shifted, not toward him, but toward the man he had just dismissed. Mr. Hand did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply repeated himself, slower now, each syllable measured, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Naomi felt it in her chest, the meaning landing before the translation even finished forming in her mind. He was not asking anymore. He was warning. About the numbers. About the partner sitting across from Victor. About something hidden beneath the surface of a deal that looked flawless on paper. Naomi's grip on the tray tightened just slightly, the only sign that anything inside her had changed. She had spent years learning when to stay quiet. Years understanding that stepping out of line, even for the right reason, could cost more than anyone in that room would ever notice. But she also knew something else. Moments like this did not come twice. And when they passed, they took the truth with them. One of the guests leaned toward Victor, whispering under his breath, "Is everything all right?" Victor gave a small nod, too quick, too controlled. "Everything is fine," he said, louder this time, reclaiming authority with tone alone. "We will continue." But the room did not follow as easily as before. The rhythm was broken. The confidence had shifted. Mr. Hand's gaze moved again, this time not searching, but steady, resting on Naomi as if he had already made a decision no one else had noticed. Naomi felt it. The invitation. Or maybe the challenge. Her heart beat once, slow and heavy, then steadied. She stepped forward. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just one step, precise enough to be intentional, subtle enough to still be mistaken for service. She set the tray down gently on the edge of the table, the soft sound barely audible but somehow louder than the silence that surrounded it. Victor noticed the movement immediately. His eyes flicked toward her, sharp, questioning. "I said," he began, the edge returning to his voice. Naomi bowed her head slightly before he could finish. Respectful. Controlled. Exactly as expected. And then she spoke, Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly. In Korean. Not the polished, textbook version most people learned. Not the simplified phrases used in business meetings. But something older. Deeper. The dialect of a specific place, shaped by years, by culture, by people who spoke less to impress and more to be understood. The words flowed naturally, without hesitation, each tone landing exactly where it belonged. She did not translate what Mr. Han had said. She responded to it. Corrected a detail. Clarified a number. Asked a question that revealed she had not only understood him, but followed the conversation more closely than anyone at the table. For a second, nothing happened. No reaction. No movement. Just stillness. And then it hit. The kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. A fork hovered above a plate. One of the guests blinked twice, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Victor's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. The confidence did not disappear. It cracked. Just slightly. Because for the first time that night, something had happened in that room that he did not control. And it came from the one person he had already dismissed. The silence did not shatter. It settled, heavier than before, pressing down on every person at the table like something unseen but undeniable. Naomi did not move after she finished speaking. She did not look around. She did not wait for approval. She simply stood there, hands steady at her sides, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everything had changed. Mr. Han's expression softened first. Not dramatically. Just enough. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time that night, there was something close to relief in his eyes. He answered her immediately, his voice no longer restrained, the rhythm of his words flowing with clarity and purpose. The conversation, once ignored, now had direction. And Naomi followed without hesitation, responding again in the same dialect, refining the details, asking precise questions, drawing out information that had been sitting in plain sight but buried under language no one else in the room understood. One of the men across the table leaned forward, confusion written across his face. What is she saying?" he whispered, not quietly enough. No one answered. Because no one could. Victor's gaze locked onto Naomi, sharper now, searching for something he could define, something he could control. But there was nothing to grasp. No arrogance. No performance. Just quiet certainty. That unsettled him more than anything else could have. "Translate," he said finally, his voice low but firm, reclaiming command the only way he knew how. Naomi paused for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge the shift, then turned slightly toward the table. Her voice changed. Not in volume, but in tone. Clear. Professional. Precise. She explained what Mr. Han had been saying from the beginning. About the numbers. About the partner. About a discrepancy buried in the projections that could cost millions if left unchecked. The room reacted in fragments. A sharp inhale. A chair shifting. A glance exchanged too quickly to hide concern. One of the executives reached for the documents in front of him, flipping pages with sudden urgency. Another leaned closer, scanning figures as if seeing them for the first time. Victor did not move. Not immediately. But the stillness around him was no longer authority. It was calculation. Because now the room was no longer following him. It was following the truth. Mr. Han spoke again, slower now, directing his words toward Naomi, not his son. And Naomi answered just as steadily, bridging the gap between languages, but more importantly, between intention and understanding. The power in the room shifted quietly, almost invisibly, but completely. It no longer belonged to the man at the head of the table. It moved through the conversation, through the clarity, through the one person no one had thought to listen to. Victor finally leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, his voice measured, controlled, but no longer effortless. How long? He asked, eyes fixed on Naomi. Have you been listening? Naomi met his gaze for the first time. Not defiant. Not afraid. Just steady. Long enough, she said calmly, to know he was trying to protect you. And for the first time that night, Victor Kane had nothing to say. Victor did not respond right away, and that silence was louder than anything he had said all night. The room watched him now, not with admiration, but with something sharper, something more cautious. Because power, once questioned, never returns to its original shape. One of the executives cleared his throat, flipping through the contract again, slower this time, as if the numbers might reveal something different under pressure. There is a discrepancy here, he muttered, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Another voice followed, less certain. These projections, they do not align with the risk profile. The conversation began to shift, not abruptly, but undeniably. It no longer moved in one direction. It fractured, branched, questioned. Victor leaned back slightly, his eyes still on Naomi, but his mind clearly elsewhere now, recalculating, adjusting, measuring the room he had once controlled so effortlessly. Mr. Han spoke again, his tone calmer, no longer urgent, but firm with quiet authority. Naomi translated without hesitation, her voice steady, carrying every nuance, every intention, without adding or taking away. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply delivered the truth as it was meant to be heard. And the truth had weight. One of the men across the table set his pen down slowly, the faint click echoing in. The stillness. Why was this not addressed earlier, he asked, not looking at Naomi, not even looking at Victor, but at the documents in front of him, as if the paper itself owed him an answer. Victor's jaw tightened, just for a moment. It is being addressed now, he replied, his voice controlled, but missing the effortless certainty it carried before. That difference did not go unnoticed. Naomi stepped back slightly, returning to her place, but the space she had stepped into did not close behind her. It remained open, occupied by something no one could ignore anymore. Mr. Han's gaze followed her for a second longer, then shifted back to the table, his posture straight, composed, no longer isolated. He spoke once more, softer this time, and Naomi translated again, her words precise, cutting through confusion like clean light. The deal was not what it appeared to be. There were conditions hidden in language that favored one side more than the other. Not illegal. Not obvious. But significant enough to change everything if overlooked. The room absorbed it slowly, like a truth too large to react to immediately. Victor exhaled quietly, his fingers tapping once against the table, a small habit that betrayed the tension beneath his control. He looked around, taking in the shifting expressions, the recalculations happening in real time. And then, finally, he looked back at Naomi. Not as staff. Not as background. But as someone who had just altered the course of a multi-million-dollar decision with nothing more than her voice. You understood all of this, he said, not a question, but not quite a statement either. Naomi met his gaze again, calm, unwavering. Yes. The word was simple. But it carried everything. The room held its breath, not because of what had already happened, but because of what would come next. Because for the first time that night, the man who had walked in believing he owned the room was now facing something he could not buy, could not command, and could not ignore. And everyone at that table knew it. The air in the room did not move the same way anymore. Conversations that once flowed easily now slowed, weighed down by something no one could ignore. It was not just the numbers. It was not just the mistake. It was the realization of who had seen it first and who had missed it completely. Victor Kane remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer the calm of control. It was the quiet of someone thinking faster than everyone else in the room, recalculating every assumption he had walked in with. Across from him, one of the senior partners adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the documents again, this time with visible urgency. If this clause holds, he said carefully, then the risk exposure is not 10%. It is closer to 30. The number landed hard. Not loudly. But heavily. Another voice followed, sharper now. That changes everything. Mr. Han spoke again, slower than before, his tone no longer urgent but steady with the kind of certainty that comes from experience, not theory. Naomi translated each word with precision, her voice cutting clean through the tension, leaving no space for misinterpretation. She did not add emphasis. She did not soften anything. She simply let the meaning stand on its own. And that made it impossible to dismiss. A quiet ripple moved through the table. Papers shifted. Chairs adjusted. The room, once centered around Victor, had begun to orbit something else entirely. Truth. Victor exhaled slowly, his fingers resting flat against the table now, no longer tapping. His eyes moved from the documents to Naomi, then to his father, then back again. There was no anger in his expression. Not yet. Just something colder. Awareness. Why, he said finally, his voice measured, controlled, was this not brought to me before tonight? The question was directed outward, but it landed nowhere. No one answered. Because everyone knew the answer did not matter anymore. What mattered was that it had been brought forward now. And not by the people who were supposed to catch it. Naomi remained where she stood, slightly behind the line of the table, no longer invisible, but not claiming space either. She had not stepped forward again. She did not need to. The room had already shifted toward her. Mr. Han turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on Victor for a moment longer than before. Then he spoke again, softer this time, but with a weight that did not require volume. Naomi listened, then translated. He says he tried, she said calmly. But you were too focused on winning to hear him. The word settled slowly, like something undeniable. Victor did not react immediately. But the change was there. Subtle. Deep. The kind that does not show on the surface, but alters everything underneath. One of the executives leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Another closed the folder in front of him, not as a decision, but as a pause. The deal was no longer moving forward. It was being reconsidered. And everyone knew why. Victor's gaze returned to Naomi, steadier now, more focused. Not dismissive. Not curious. Evaluating. You are not just a server, he said, his tone quieter, but sharper than before. It was not a compliment. It was a realization. Naomi held his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied simply. And for the first time that night, the truth in that room was no longer hidden in a language no one understood. It was spoken clearly. And it had already changed the outcome. No one reached for their drink anymore. The glasses sat untouched, the ice slowly melting, the sound of it faint but somehow louder than the silence that had taken over the table. The energy had shifted too far to go back. This was no longer a dinner. It was a reckoning disguised as one. Victor Kane leaned back in his chair, but this time, it was not a gesture of control. It was distance. Space to think. Space to see the room for what it had become. A room that was no longer following him without question. Across the table, one of the partners spoke carefully, choosing each word like it carried weight. We need to pause this, he said. Not a suggestion. A decision forming in real time. Another nodded, slower, more deliberate. We revisit the terms. All of them. The deal that had felt inevitable an hour ago now sat fragile, uncertain, balanced on information that had almost been ignored. And everyone knew exactly who had changed that. Victor's gaze shifted again, landing on Naomi with a clarity that had not been there before. He was not looking through her anymore. He was looking at her. Measuring. Reassessing. Trying to understand how someone he had dismissed in seconds had just altered the trajectory of a negotiation worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Mr. Han spoke quietly, his tone no longer carrying urgency, but something steadier. Approval. Naomi listened, then translated, her voice even, grounded. He says clarity is not disrespect. Ignoring truth is. The word settled deeper than anything else that had been said that night. No one argued. No one laughed. Because there was nothing left to dismiss. Victor lowered his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recognition. A calculation completed. A perspective adjusted. When he looked back up, something had changed. Not his authority. That was still there. But the way he held it. "Step forward," he said, his voice calm, no longer edged with dismissal. It was not a command. It was a request shaped like one. Naomi hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but out of awareness. This moment mattered. Then she stepped forward, stopping just beside the table, within the circle she had never been meant to enter. Every eye followed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she had already earned it. Victor studied her for a moment longer, then asked, "Where did you learn that dialect?" The question was simple, but the room leaned in as if the answer would explain everything. Naomi did not rush. "From my grandmother," she said. She was from Busan. A small detail. But it carried history. Depth. Something no training manual could replicate. Mr. Hand's expression shifted again, this time unmistakable. Recognition. Not just of the language, but of the roots behind it. He spoke directly to her, slower now, his tone softer, almost personal. Naomi listened, then responded in the same dialect, her voice matching his pace, his cadence, as if the space between them had quietly disappeared. The room did not understand the words. But they understood what they were witnessing. Respect. Real respect. The kind that could not be forced, bought, or negotiated. Victor watched the exchange without interruption. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room was no longer defined by wealth, position, or title. It was defined by something far rarer. Understanding. And for the first time that night, Victor Kane was not the one leading the conversation. He was learning from it. The room did not return to normal. It evolved. What had once been a stage for control had quietly transformed into something else entirely, something more fragile, more honest. Naomi and Mr. Han continued speaking, their voices calm, measured, existing in a rhythm that felt separate from the rest of the table, as if they were operating on a different layer of understanding. Each exchange carried meaning beyond words, shaped by shared nuance, by cultural memory, by something no spreadsheet or contract could capture. The others watched, unable to follow the language, but fully aware that whatever was being said mattered more than anything written in front of them. Victor Kane remained still, his eyes moving between them, not interrupting, not asserting control, but observing with a focus that had replaced his earlier certainty. He was no longer trying to dominate the room. He was trying to understand it. Mr. Hand's voice softened further, his posture relaxing in a way that had not been visible all night. He spoke slowly, carefully, and Naomi listened with full attention before responding in the same tone, her words carrying both respect and clarity. Then she turned slightly toward the table and translated. "He says the numbers were not the only concern," she said evenly. "He says the intent behind them matters more." The statement landed differently than the others. It was not about profit. It was about trust. One of the partners frowned slightly, leaning back as if reconsidering more than just the deal. Another folded his hands together, no longer scanning documents, but thinking. The conversation had moved beyond figures. It had entered something deeper. Mr. Han spoke again, this time with a faint, almost imperceptible warmth in his tone. Naomi responded without hesitation, and for a brief moment, there was a softness in her expression that had not been there before. Not vulnerability. Recognition. Then she translated once more. "He says he has not heard his hometown spoken like that in many years." A quiet shift passed through the room. It was subtle, but undeniable. The tension did not disappear. It transformed. What had been pressure became attention. What had been dismissal became respect. Victor's gaze lowered briefly, his hand resting against the table, fingers still, no longer tapping, no longer signaling control. When he looked up again, his expression had changed again, not dramatically, but enough. There was no trace of the earlier smirk. No casual dismissal. Only focus. "You heard him when I did not," he said, his voice quieter now, not directed at the room, but at Naomi alone. It was not accusation. It was acknowledgement. Naomi held his gaze, steady as before. He was not being quiet, she replied. He was being ignored. The words did not cut. They settled. And in that moment, they carried more weight than anything else that had been said that night. No one spoke after that. Not immediately. Because there was nothing left to fill the space with. The truth had already done that. Victor leaned back slowly, exhaling, not in frustration, but in something closer to clarity. Around him, the room remained still, but not frozen. Present. Aware. The kind of stillness that comes when something important has just been understood, even if it has not yet been fully accepted. And at the center of it all stood Naomi Carter, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but not elevated either. She had not taken power. She had revealed it. And that changed everything. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt full. Full of realization, full of quiet recalculations, full of a truth that had already taken root in every mind at the table. No one rushed to speak because no one wanted to be the one to break what had just been revealed. Victor Kane sat still, his posture composed, but the energy around him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. He was still powerful. That had not changed. But power without awareness had just been exposed, and everyone in the room had seen it happen in real time. One of the partners finally leaned forward again, his voice careful, slower than before. "If the intent is misaligned," he said, choosing each word with precision, "then the agreement needs to be reconsidered entirely." This time, no one pushed back. Not even Victor. Because the conversation was no longer about defending positions. It was about correcting them. Papers were no longer being scanned for confirmation. They were being studied for truth. Mr. Han watched quietly, his gaze steady, no longer searching to be heard. He had already been heard. Naomi stood beside the table, her presence calm, grounded, but now undeniably central to everything unfolding. She did not step forward again. She did not claim attention. But the room continued to move around her as if guided by something she had set in motion. Mr. Han spoke again, softer now, his tone reflective rather than urgent. Naomi listened, then translated with the same clarity as before. "He says business built on misunderstanding will always collapse," she said evenly. "Not immediately. But eventually." The word settled deeper than the others. Not as a warning this time, but as a principle. Something older than the deal itself. One of the executives nodded slowly, as if recognizing a lesson he had learned too late in the past. Another closed his folder completely, not in defeat, but in decision. The direction was clear now. Victor's gaze lowered to the table for a brief moment, his hand resting flat against the surface, fingers still. When he looked back up, the sharpness in his expression had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer directed outward. It was focused inward. "We pause this," he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, but different. Not weaker. More deliberate. "We review every term again. From the beginning." No one questioned it. Because this time, the decision was not driven by dominance. It was driven by understanding. And that carried more weight than anything else he could have said. The room shifted again, but this time, it was not tension. It was alignment. Not perfect. Not comfortable. But real. Victor's eyes moved once more to Naomi, holding there longer than before. "You saw what none of us did," he said quietly. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement, stripped of ego, stripped of performance. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. He showed it, she replied simply. I just listened. The simplicity of the answer carried more impact than any explanation could have. Because it reframed everything. This was not about intelligence alone. It was about attention. Respect. The willingness to hear what others ignore. Mr. Hand's expression softened again, a faint nod following her words, as if confirming something that had been understood long before this night. Around the table, the atmosphere had changed completely. The deal was no longer the center of the room. The lesson was. And for the first time that night, every person there knew exactly where the real value had come from. Not from power. Not from position. But from the one voice that had chosen not to stay silent when it mattered most. No one rushed to stand. No one reached for their phone. The kind of urgency that usually followed a decision like this was gone, replaced by something slower, heavier, more deliberate. The room had not just changed direction. It had changed awareness. Victor. Kane remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the table, but the stillness now carried intention instead of control. He was not holding the room anymore. He was holding the moment. Across from him, the partners exchanged quiet glances, not to confirm authority, but to align understanding. The deal was paused, but more than that, it was being reconsidered from a foundation that had not existed an hour ago. Mr. Hand sat with quiet composure, his presence no longer overlooked, no longer translated only through assumption. He had spoken, and now the room was listening even when he was silent. Naomi stood where she had been, just outside the table's edge, but there was no longer a boundary around her. The space had opened, not because she stepped into it, but because the room had shifted to include her. Victor looked at her again, longer this time, not with calculation, but with something closer to clarity. You changed the outcome tonight, he said, his voice steady, stripped of performance. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a fact. Naomi did not react immediately. She did not step forward. She did not soften her posture. She simply answered, no. I revealed it. The distinction settled deeply. Because it reframed everything that had happened. This was not about intervention. It was about attention. About hearing what was already there. Mr. Hand spoke quietly once more, his tone carrying a calm that had replaced the earlier urgency. Naomi listened, then translated, her voice even, grounded. He says truth does not arrive late, she said. People just recognize it late. A faint shift passed through the room. Not discomfort. Not resistance. Something closer to acceptance. One of the executives leaned back slowly, letting out a breath, his expression thoughtful, no longer defensive. Another nodded almost imperceptibly, as if agreeing with something he had not been ready to hear before. Victor lowered his gaze briefly, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, then lifting again as he looked back at Naomi. What is your name? He asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight now. Naomi answered without hesitation. Naomi Carter. He repeated it once, quietly, as if committing it to memory. Not because he needed to. Because he chose to. Mr. Hand smiled faintly, a small, genuine expression that had been absent all night. He spoke again, directly to Naomi, his tone warm, respectful. Naomi responded in the same dialect, her voice softer now, matching his pace, his tone, as if the conversation had moved beyond necessity into something more human. When she translated, her words carried a subtle shift. He says respect is not given by status, she said. It is recognized by understanding. No one argued. No one questioned it. Because the entire room had just witnessed it happen. Victor nodded once, slowly, the movement small but deliberate. Then he stood. Not abruptly. Not to reclaim dominance. But to acknowledge something that had already been established. The others followed, not out of habit, but because the moment called for it. The meeting was no longer about closing a deal. It was about correcting a path. And as Victor adjusted his jacket and looked once more at Naomi Carter, there was no trace of the man who had dismissed her at the beginning of the night. There was only someone who had learned, in real time, that power without listening is incomplete. And that sometimes, the voice that changes everything is the one you almost chose not to hear. The room did not disperse immediately. People stood, but they did not leave. Conversations did not restart the way they usually did after a meeting. There were no loud follow-ups, no rushed handshakes, no quick exits to take calls. Instead, there was a pause that felt intentional, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something that could not be reduced to business as usual. Victor Kane remained standing at the head of the table, but he was no longer positioned above it. The distance between him and everyone else had narrowed, not physically, but in something far more important. Perspective. Across from him, one of the senior partners closed his folder slowly and looked up. "We will need time," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Not just to revise the numbers. To reconsider the structure entirely." This time, the statement did not challenge Victor. It aligned with him. Victor nodded once, measured, controlled, but without resistance. "You will have it," he replied. There was no negotiation in his voice. No attempt to push forward. The decision had already been made. Mr. Han rose from his seat with quiet dignity, his movement steady, unhurried. The room shifted slightly as people made space, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had been earned, not assumed. He turned toward Naomi, his gaze warm, grounded, carrying something deeper than appreciation. He spoke to her again in the dialect, slower now, each word deliberate, almost reflective. Naomi listened closely, then answered with the same calm precision she had carried all night. Their exchange was brief, but it held weight beyond its length. When she translated, her voice softened just slightly. "He says tonight reminded him that wisdom does not always sit at the head of the table," she said. "Sometimes it stands quietly beside it." The word settled into the room like something permanent. No one moved to fill the silence that followed. Because it did not need filling. It needed to be felt. Victor watched the exchange closely, then took a step forward, closing the distance that had existed all night. Not as a gesture of authority, but as a recognition of it. "Naomi," he said, her name no longer unfamiliar on his tongue. "Walk with us." It was not a command. It was an invitation. One that would not have existed an hour earlier. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding what the moment represented. Then she nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and stepped forward to join them. The room adjusted again, subtly, instinctively. Not because she demanded space, but because she now belonged in it. As they moved toward the exit, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights outside, millions of points of brightness stretching into the distance, each one a reminder of how vast the world was beyond that single room. And yet, what had happened inside it carried more weight than anything visible outside. One of the executives lingered behind, watching them go, his expression thoughtful, almost unsettled. Because moments like this were rare. Not dramatic. Not loud. But undeniable. The kind that reshaped how people saw things, long after the night ended. Victor slowed his pace slightly as they reached the doorway, turning just enough to look at Naomi again. Not to question her. Not to measure her. But to acknowledge something that had already been proven. "You did not step out of your place tonight," he said quietly. "You showed us what it should have been." Naomi met his gaze, steady as ever. "It was always there," she replied. "You just could not hear it." And this time, there was no silence after her words. Only understanding. The hallway outside the private dining room felt different from the space they had just left behind. The noise returned slowly, the distant hum of conversations, the soft echo of footsteps against polished marble, the faint clink of glass from another room where nothing had changed. But for the three of them, everything had. Victor Kane walked at a measured pace, his usual confidence still present, but no longer loud, no longer something he needed to project. It was quieter now, more contained, as if it had been reshaped by something he could not ignore. Mr. Han moved beside him with calm steadiness, his presence no longer overshadowed, no longer filtered through assumption or distance. And Naomi Carter walked just slightly behind, not because she had been placed there, but because she chose it. Not stepping ahead. Not stepping away. Simply present. They reached the elevator, the glass doors reflecting their silhouettes back at them, three figures standing in a moment that had not existed before that night. For a second, no one pressed the button. No one rushed to speak. Because silence, for once, was not uncomfortable. It was understood. Mr. Han broke it first, his voice low, gentle, speaking again in the dialect that had shifted everything. Naomi listened, then responded, her tone softer now, no longer translating for a room, but speaking directly, person to person. The exchange was brief, but it carried something deeper than the words themselves. When she translated, her voice held a quiet warmth. He says you reminded him of someone, she said, glancing briefly at Victor before finishing, someone who knew when to listen more than speak. Victor did not respond immediately. He looked at his reflection in the glass for a moment, then at Naomi, then at his father. There was no defensiveness in his expression. Only recognition. I have spent years believing control meant speaking first, he said finally, his voice calm, reflective. Tonight proved something else. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but none of them moved right away. Because what was being said mattered more than where they were going. Naomi met his gaze, steady as always. Control without understanding is just noise, she replied. It fills the room, but it does not lead it. The words did not challenge him. They aligned with something he had already begun to see. Mr. Han nodded faintly, his approval quiet but unmistakable. Victor stepped into the elevator first, then turned slightly, holding the door open, not out of habit, but intention. Naomi and Mr. Han followed, the space inside small compared to the room they had left, but somehow more honest. As the doors closed, the city lights outside reflected across the glass walls, stretching endlessly into the night, each light separate, yet part of something larger. Victor glanced at Naomi again, his tone quieter now, no longer shaped by authority, but by curiosity grounded in respect. You said your grandmother was from Busan, he said. Did she teach you everything you know? Naomi shook her head slightly. She taught me how to listen, she said. The rest came from paying attention. The elevator began to descend, smooth, steady, the motion almost unnoticeable, like the shift that had happened over the course of the evening. Mr. Han spoke once more, his voice soft, reflective, and Naomi answered in the same tone, the dialect flowing naturally between them. Then she translated one final time. He says tonight was not about business, she said. It was about remembering what matters before business begins. The word settled into the small space, filling it without pressure, without resistance. And as the elevator carried them downward, away from the room where everything had changed, one truth remained clear. Power had not left Victor Kane that night. It had evolved. And it had done so because, for the first time in a long time, he chose to hear what had always been there. The elevator doors opened to the quiet glow of the lobby, where polished floors reflected soft light and distant conversations blended into a low, steady hum. The world outside had not changed. People still moved with purpose. Deals were still being made. Voices still carried confidence and certainty. But for the three who stepped out, something fundamental had shifted, something that would not be undone by the rhythm of another night. Victor Kane paused just beyond the threshold, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. He had walked into that building with certainty. He walked out with clarity. And the difference between the two was something he would carry far beyond that evening. Mr. Han stood beside him, calm and grounded, his presence no longer something that could be overlooked or translated away. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded attention. And yet, he had changed everything simply by refusing to let truth go unheard. Naomi Carter remained just slightly behind them, her posture the same, her expression composed, as if the night had not altered her at all. But it had. Not in the way others might expect. She had not gained power. She had not sought recognition. She had done something far quieter and far more lasting. She had reminded a room full of powerful people what they had forgotten. Victor turned to her, not as a man addressing staff, but as someone speaking to another person whose presence had become undeniable. "You could have stayed silent," he said, his voice even, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of a choice. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "So could he," she replied, glancing briefly at Mr. Han. "But silence does not protect what matters. It only delays the cost." The word settled without resistance. Because they were not dramatic. They were true. Mr. Han spoke softly one last time, his tone reflective, almost gentle, and Naomi listened before translating, her voice calm and clear. "He says tonight was not about being heard," she said. "It was about choosing to listen when it was easier not to." Victor nodded slowly, the movement small, but deliberate. Not agreement. Acceptance. The kind that comes after something has already changed inside you. Around them, the lobby continued its quiet motion, unaware of what had unfolded just floors above. But moments like this were never about the crowd. They were about the few who understood them. Victor adjusted his jacket, a familiar gesture but no longer a signal of control. This time, it felt like closure. He looked at Naomi once more, not to measure her, not to define her, but to recognize her. "If you ever decide you do not belong in a room like that," he said, his voice steady, "you are wrong." Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, not for effect, but because the moment deserved it. "I have always belonged," she said quietly. "I just never needed the room to notice." There was no argument after that. No need for one. Because the truth had already settled into place. Mr. Han smiled faintly, a quiet expression of approval, then turned toward the exit, his steps steady, unhurried. Victor followed, his pace aligned with his father's for the first time that night, not leading, not ahead, but beside. Naomi watched them go for a brief moment, then turned back toward the hallway, toward the work she had come to do, her role unchanged on the surface, but redefined in meaning. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She did not try to prove anything beyond what had already been seen. And yet, she had done something no one else in that room could. She had changed the direction of power without ever trying to hold it. Because power, as the night had revealed, was never about who spoke the loudest. It was about who understood what truly needed to be heard. And in the end, the room did not belong to the one who controlled it. It belonged to the one who could change it without saying a single unnecessary word.